Hello and welcome to 2 Samuel 2. We're looking at verses 12 through to 17 today. These are important verses because sadly these are the beginnings of the demise of Israel in terms of its unity at this time of its human history. We know, of course, that after this time David becomes the ruler of a united kingdom. But in terms of the fractures that lead to the eventual dissolution of the United Kingdom, the seeds are sown here, sadly. They may take a few more years to gain absolute fruition at the end of Solomon's reign with his son Rehoboam, but the seeds are sown right here, sadly. And the seeds that are sown are the reality that, generally speaking, in human history, politicians behave like politicians in the sense that they try and construct the best possible solution, quite often for their own self-interest or for the interest of those they represent or for the interest of their tribal groups. Now, in the ancient world, politicians were often military men as well, which made the complication of armed conflict altogether more real. There wasn't this massive division that we have today in human history between those involved with politics, the cut and thrust of making legal and political decisions, and those on the other side of the fence regarding the safety of the country in terms of the army. There's a far tighter bond in the ancient world than there is in our world. Verse 12. Now, if you've been following along, you'd be reminded, hopefully, as we begin these verses, that most of the people who are actually in charge of things are close relatives of those who are actually above them. So David, his own relative is Joab, and obviously on the other side, Ishbosheth, his father, who was Saul, is the cousin of Abner, the commander of his army. And what we have here is political intrigue. They are trying to organise a meeting together by which they could come and discuss and work out the politics of their situation, I suspect in order to make it less likely they'd be at war with one another and then have a third party, namely the Philistines, come in once again and squash them. So they're trying to create a type of truce whilst maintaining their political superiority over one another, but not so superior that they end up fighting each other. As you can see, it would be a delicate balance. But they're not going to join forces because who's going to be the king? Ishbosheth or David? Who's going to be the commander of the army? Joab or Abner? And so we have this political maneuvering occurring in our text right up front in verse 12. Let me read it to you. Abner, son of Ner, that's there to remind us of the relationship that Abner himself has with the former household of Saul, together with the men of Ishbosheth. So remember, Abner and Saul were cousins. Ishbosheth is the son of Saul. They left Mahanaim and went to Gibeon. This is back to Saul's own sort of hometown area. Remember, the entire family are Benjamites, and Gibeon is one of the lead cities in the tribe of Benjamin. On the other side, Joab, son of Zeruiah, and David's men went out and met them at the pool of Gibeon. Now, in terms of the distance that both have had to travel, it is obvious from the geography that the men of Abner have had to travel a lot further than the men of Joab. The other thing that's evident is that the kings are not there. And so this may be some sort of intermediate peace treaty, a bit like finding out where each other is at. Where can we find a common bond and a common truce? And it looks like on the surface that the men of Abner have started marching towards Gibeon, in order to, I suppose, fortify their stronghold and their territory. And that is a longer march than the men of Joab. So once it seems like Joab's heard this, then he himself has gone off to say, what's going on? What is happening? How can we not be at war together? How can we be at peace, but not so much at peace that the Philistines want to invade us? How can we also not fight each other, that one of us gets weakened and the Philistines invade us? And as you can see, the delicate balance begins. Around this pool at Gibeon, one group sat down on one side of the pool and one group on the other side of the pool. This is a bit like Knights of the Round Table under King Arthur. They're trying to give us the picture in the text that it's sort of a mutual meeting of those in a symmetrical relationship with one another around this pool. On one side you have this clan, on the other side you have this, and the two forces are equal. But we know that's not the case, don't we? In politics, someone always thinks they got the upper hand. And in this case, it is Joab. He thinks that as David's representative, as the anointed king of Israel, down back at Hebron, he thinks that he has the upper hand because he's just been party to the group of warriors that have defeated the Amalekites. He's had victory. In fact, he's never lost with David. He's always been victorious by David's side. In fact, so much by David's side that it probably annoyed the life out of Abner, who wanted to be the commander of Saul's army all the time, but did not get the opportunity until after Saul got rid of David, and he was the one responsible for keeping Saul safe, and he failed. He has been the commander of the army that's just been decimated by the Philistines. He's taken the last 5 years to cement his position within the army and within the northern area that is controlled now by Ishbosheth. And it's obvious in the text that they say that it is not Ishbosheth who is really the king. Abner made him the king. In other words, he's a king, all right, but it's Abner as the commander of the army that has the real power here. So it may seem like the meeting of equals, but Joab certainly believes he is the main man in charge of David's army. And Abner, well, he is trying to solidify his position in order to keep himself being killed by either the Philistines or David. Verse 14, then Abner said to Joab, let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us. All right, let them do it, Joab said. So they stood up and were counted off, 12 men for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 for David. Then each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his dagger into his opponent's side. And they fell down together. So that place in Gibeon was called Helkath Hadzurim. The battle that day was very fierce, and Abner and the Israelites were defeated by David's men. So much for politics. It seems like in many times in the ancient world, that groups of men got together here. We're not sure whether that each of the 12 had it in their mind already to try and stab the other group. The 12 here seemingly are representative of the 12 tribes of Israel, and the idea may have been that whoever was victorious in this 12 group, instead of having the bloodshed of war, we would then sign a peace treaty in order to say, yes, you're the winner. A bit like David and Goliath, if you recall. That battle there looked like on the surface that whoever won of David v. Goliath would get the spoils of the opposing country. We know that's not how it turned out, but that is seemingly what may have been the backdrop. And that could be the backdrop here. But whatever the backdrop was, neither party kept their end of the bargain. All we are told is that both groups of men either conspired or something happened in the fighting that led them to killing one another. So what started off potentially as a game of sport, but we're not sure, ended up being a game of murder. And so the outcome was all are dead. So who's victorious? Who's the main country? Who's the main winner? Well, remember what we already knew. This symmetry relationship around this pool was a facade. It was not a equal meeting of parties. Abner was wanting to solidify his position in Gibeon. Joab, on behalf of David, would not have a bar of it. And what we find out in the next couple of weeks will be Joab's relationship with David is very tenuous. In fact, it's probably only good at any point in time because of their own relationship to one another, where David, his sister, is Zeruiah, who is the mother of this man Joab. And so the nephews of David basically run amok, and it looks like civil war is breaking out. They went there maybe to search for peace. They may have even went there to try and force the other into submission and to join forces. I suspect more likely Joab thought that Ishbosheth was so weak that potentially if he got Abner to secede away from him, then possibly David could take over peacefully. All things that decided by men in the art of politics, sadly, don't come to fruition because they existed here outside of God. We can see human plans, human decisions made without God's blessing. Joab and Abner were political and military operators. The sad reality is that we can learn that for ourselves. Making decisions outside of God's understanding, outside of God's will, outside of God's teachings may seem wise in human eyes, but are never wise in God's. Amen.